So making sure that you have the right to do it, talking about the people that you know you're affecting, but also thinking about the people that you're not affecting. So you always make an assumption that you're targeted, so making sure that you're actually checking those assumptions is the final part in terms of power. So it's basically a ways to make sure that people are always cognizant of the power that they have over others and making sure that they're not abusing it to arbitrary or discriminatory ends. The final thing that I want to talk about is the different kinds of rights. So there are two types. There are positive rights and there are negative rights. I don't like to refer to them to that because I always get mixed up between which is the other. And so I call them obligations versus protections, which makes a lot more sense because you immediately understand what's going to be coming next. It's a very useful thing to do in a debate context because you shouldn't be using terms that are really opaque and really difficult to understand. You should be trying to use terms that people can immediately understand, okay, this is what you're talking about. So a positive right doesn't necessarily tell you anything unless you've taken a philosophy or law course or debated a lot and understand what a positive right is. An obligation, on the other hand, is something that everyone can kind of understand at a more elementary level because it shows that, okay, I have a duty towards somebody else. This is something that I have to do, which is what a positive right is, as opposed to a protection, which is something that I can't do, which is what a negative right is. So typically this kind of relationship is going to be between citizens and their state. Sometimes it's between citizens and corporations. At a very broad level, it's between individuals and groups. And the rights that individuals grant to their group and the group's rights that they grant to their individuals. So in terms of obligations, there's a duty of care from one to the other. This isn't just necessarily the state has a duty of care towards its citizens in terms of it has to provide education and health care, but also duties of care from individuals towards their states. So looking into things like stability, looking into things like due process and stuff like that, to making sure that people don't totally run rampant and destroy groups. So there is a balance, of course, on both sides. Usually, though, positive rights and obligations are coming from a group, such as a state, onto its citizens. So these are things that it has to do as a duty of care. So these are things like, we need to make sure that our citizens are healthy, therefore we have health care. Education is a benefit for everyone, therefore we have, as someone who has their role of stewardship over everyone within the group, we should be providing them with education. And so it's things like that, and it's ways of thinking that are about, okay, what am I? Why does this group exist? What is the purpose of this group? Are we meeting that purpose in a meaningful way? So if you are a government, you are obviously there to govern. If you are not doing your job, you're failing as an entity, and that's why you have positive obligations. It's to make sure that when you are going out into the world, you are doing the things that you're supposed to, that the reason why you've been given power are these duties that you have. Your obligations are therefore the realization of that initial will from individuals to create a broader group. Protections happen in the opposite direction. It's what can't we do to one another. So this is kind of an argument of what are our obligations to not do things? What are our obligations to not interfere? In what ways are we overstepping our bounds if we do something? So if you wanted to look at negative rights, it's things like privacy and it's things like the right to association. Because the government doesn't necessarily have to create some kind of union for you to join. It doesn't have to create groups for you. But it has an obligation to protect your ability to get into those groups in the first place. It can't interfere with those groups. It can't interfere with your ability to join them unless it has a very pressing need to do so for other reasons. The difficulty with positive and negative rights is that they always exist within a balance. And in fact, all rights exist within a balance. And so when someone has the right to association, that means that they should be able to join together as a group for any purpose whatsoever, theoretically in a world of absolutes. But in reality, that poses a danger to other people. It poses a danger to people outside of the group. The group might have certain tendencies that are dangerous to everybody else. Those are all things that states have a positive obligation to prevent. And so the state has to balance its negative obligation, or its negative protection for association, with its positive obligation for public safety, for instance. And so that's where you get things like hate speech coming in, is that it's fundamentally that balance between we can't interfere with people's ability to say what's on their mind because of all of these reasons in terms of how we will corrupt our societies and destroy our mandate as a state, but at the same time, hate speech poses potential dangers to people, which is our positive obligation to prevent. One of the most interesting ones that I actually like in terms of this is due process rights. Because there you have a very positive obligation that shows why the state, or how the state functions and how the state gets and uses power. The reason why due process is such an incredibly important right For those that don't know, due process is things like being able to have a lawyer, having fair courts, having a jury system, not having totally imbalanced laws placed against you, is that the state is granted a whole bunch of power by citizens in order to enact justice. Individual citizens aren't allowed to do that. They give that power to the state in terms of the group that oversees it. And as a result of that, the group has effectively a monopoly on what justice is going to mean in your society. Without due process, that obligation can go horribly wrong because you can start just putting people in prison for no reason. The problem with that is that no one has the ability to resist that. Once that power of justice has been given and it has started to be abused, it becomes almost impossible to take it away. It's why states typically start sort of totalitarian and become much more totalitarian later, because it is impossible to resist that process of random incarceration because you might be randomly incarcerated when you're trying to resist it. So that's why there's a positive obligation for due process, is that the state has this power which it can be very corrupt if it uses incorrectly. So it has an obligation to use it properly. That obligation comes about through due process. Are there any questions about rights in a debate context? Or things that I've said that maybe don't make sense? That kind of makes sense? Okay. So the overview is to always remember that rights are balanced, always remember that rights are defined and contextual, and always remember that rights are about a balance of power, a balance of knowledge, and a certain degree of blindness and non-arbitrariness. If you can use those concepts all together, you can approach rights rounds in a way that's fairly robust. You have a lot of things that you can talk about immediately because you've already answered the basic questions. Why does this right exist? What am I going to do with this right? How am I going to use this right? And what does it mean to access this right? Those are your fundamental questions, and they all come about when you think about it in that framework of balancing and defining. And that's the end of the seminar.